Last time we left off with the benefits of townships, cities, the growth of urbanization in the medieval world. We have the growth of towns and trade, and which are requiring reliable currency. Regions with regulated currency were the earliest participants in the commercial revolution. We have multiple currencies requiring money changers and bankers.
Here we find the market square of Krakow in Poland. This view of the Rynek, the main market square of Krakow, was taken from the medieval tower of St. Mary's Basilica. It emphasizes the extraordinary scale of commercial activity that has taken place here since the 11th century. Measuring about 430,000 square feet, it is one of the largest medieval town squares in Europe and a symbol of urban prosperity and pride. Although the handsome cloth hall in the center was not built until the 15th century, it stands on the site of market stalls dating back to the foundation of the city. Recent excavations of the square itself have revealed artifacts from numerous artisanal workshops. We can compare the scale of this market with the plan of Parison on page 265. What historical factors might account for the far more generous proportions of this newer medieval town?
Indeed, whoever thinks the medieval world wasn't connected or peasants didn't ever leave their village really should see this. Here is a map of medieval trade routes. What does this map reveal about the relationship between waterways and overland routes during the 11th and 12th centuries? Which regions appear to be most extensively interconnected and why? How does the trade in certain specialized goods create certain commercial patterns?
Remember, the early medieval world is a world without a bank system. So much of this trade was made possible thanks to Jewish moneylenders, who were allowed to become the first bankers. Now we have a network of Jewish communities. Christians theoretically were forbidden to lend money. It was called usury. There was a moral stigma of money-lending trade, which made Jews a target for violence. And, of course, a perpetuation of negative conspiracy theories.
With wealth comes leadership, responsibility, and power, unless you're Jewish. There's a new wealth which fosters both social mobility and social stratification, of course, unless you're Jewish. And new families begin to establish themselves as territorial lords. Say it with me, unless you're Jewish. New lords, though, would protect territories and followers by building castles, and castles begin to dominate the landscape. They serve as both defense and offense, particularly for holding cavalry, but they are also political structures as well. They often would form the nucleus of new towns. As new lords challenge the old, they're going to claim descent from the Vikings and break away from that Roman past. We talked more about that last time.
Now, nobility in the Carolingian period is a small percentage of the population. Castles allowed the lord to dominate landscape. They started as wooden structures, increasingly became stone constructions. The lords needed assistance of warriors to defend their claims. They maintained private armies of men heavily equipped. And we have knighthood.
So, what do we mean by knighthood? Well, we have this new social order of men, widely varying in social rank, who have a specialized, effectively warrior task. They are a warrior group associated largely with the nobility. But here is your opportunity as a knight to either ascend from effectively the lay, the peasantry, or from, of course, descend from the nobility should you fall out of favor and lose your wealth. Being a knight is going to become very expensive. And speaking of expensive constructions, here is York Castle in England. This fortification exemplifies some of the major phases of medieval castle building. The large mound is effectively the remains of the earthwork erected under the orders of William the Conqueror in 1068, when it would have been covered with a wooden palisade. This is the most basic type of construction called a motte and bailey. York Castle would actually remain a wooden tower until it was eventually destroyed by a fire in 1245. Surprise how that happens, isn't it? Well, it's now known as Clifford's Tower because of the rebel Sir Roger Clifford, who was held there prisoner prior to his execution in 1322. And of course, now you see the new stone construction.
Now, homage becomes a central ceremony. The knights, lords, and vassals, we have the political and military power in the hands of wealthy landowners. We have centralized Europe's growing wealth for themselves, which, of course, exercised enormous power over property rights, coinage, law, military, and taxation.
Here's a ceremony of homage to give you an idea of what it looks like. While not, say, the wanderer's head on knee, hand on knee, loyally laying, see my wanderer video for that. But powerful rituals like this one were key to forging social and political bonds in the medieval world. This manuscript image depicts the ritual through which the man, in French homme, would swear fealty to his lord, paying him homage and recognizing their new relationship. But notice it is a formal affair. In the background, a scribe documents the exchange of vows in a very legally binding sense. So, how does this image represent the power dynamics between the two men and their postures and gestures? What does it suggest about their reliance on one another?
However, this feudalism doesn't pass the realism test. Let's go over how it's supposed to work first before the professor breaks the theories back. Feudalism is a highly decentralized political system, and there are varieties of interpretation. Feudalism defined a political system in which public powers were exercised by private lords. A fief is a contract in which something of value was exchanged for service. A vassal was the recipient of a fief, and homage is a solemn act in which a vassal becomes the man of his lord.
So, in other words, you pay homage, congratulations, you get a fief, right? And become a vassal of your lord. Ergo, you're supposed to take the effective monetary gain, the taxation, etc., you would gain from your fiefdom and pass that along to your lord in exchange for keeping a small percentage and maintaining control. All well and good. Oh, not really. We have varieties of interpretation for this system. If we look at the Marxist, it's purely economic, such as what I just detailed for you. But there are social historians who focus on, say, literally, quite literally, the social control or other aspects of it. But we also have legal historians and military historians who see this more so as a means of keeping and maintaining an army that greater lords or kings don't need to pay for because the individual fiefs are meant to raise those troops. So, the idea of feudalism actually first takes shape in the Carolingian Empire and was really justifying a hierarchical legal and political order, one that quickly breaks down as we move through the 12th century. Personal relationships of service in return for this landholding, these are necessary for the maintenance of order, but remember that when you give your lords power, those you're giving homage to as well, your vassals' power, of course, below them, everybody's putting pressure from the bottom up on their lordships. So we have to really begin to ask ourselves, is the term feudalism still useful as a concept, or has it become a misleading myth? Particularly when the lords under the king, who are, of course, the vassals of the king, are putting pressure on the king to get what they want, not what the king wants. You'll see an example of this when we get to, Prince John the Worst. But what problems does it solve, and what others does it create?
Now there's a new monarchy in town, the English. Let's look at the new feudal monarchy of England. In 1066, Duke William of Normandy claimed to be successor of the English king. The English people had elected Harold as king.
And once Harold's elected king, William defeats Harold at the Battle of Hastings and, well, takes power.
And that's all your textbook says. That's all the company wants you to talk about? I'm sorry, but this is unacceptable. In 1066, on the 5th of January, King Edward the Confessor dies. The 6th of January, Edward the Confessor is buried at Westminster Abbey.
I agree, we should at least go over a little bit more detail, as Harold Godwinson is chosen by the Witenagemot to be king over Edward's nephew, Edgar Atheling, who was, of course, only 15 at the time, so we understand. Harold, though, is crowned that very day, most likely at Westminster Abbey, and about this time, maybe earlier, Harold is married to Eglith, the daughter of Alfgar, the Earl of Mercia. She's also the widow of the Welsh ruler Gruffudd of Lelwyn, and forgive me, I don't do Welsh here. That's my own problem. But by May, Tostig Godwinson, Harold's brother, it does attempt to invade England. He lands in the Isle of Wight and also in Kent, and is actually ultimately forced to return to Scotland. But by September 20th, we have the Battle of Fulford, where Harold III of Norway would be accompanied by Tostig Godwinson, who invades England and defeats the English forces led by Morcar of Northumbria and Edwin, Earl of Mercia in Yorkshire. By the 25th of September, we have the Battle of Stamford Bridge, the one you're probably familiar with King Harold II defeating and, of course, killing Harold III of Norway and Tostig. But on September 28th, here's where things get spicy as Duke William the Bastard lands his invasion force in Pevensey, and King Harold then immediately has to turn his victorious army around south and gather more troops as he does, such that in the Battle of Hastings on October 14th, William's forces will sadly defeat Harold, and probably this was at Senlac Hill in East Sussex, but there's still a little debate about that. Edgar Atheling will be proclaimed king at the Witenagemot and in London, but he will eventually submit to William a few weeks later after undergoing a failed rebellion at he's going to submit at Berkhamsted.
Now, in late October or early December, Stigand, who had been the Archbishop of Canterbury, will submit to William at Wallingford. And on the 25th of December, we have the coronation of William I of England in Westminster Abbey. Thank you, Wikipedia, for the timeline.
And see, class, Wikipedia can be useful. But I guess YouTube is good for something in the sense that I can't normally fit all of that in my class. So, anyway, back to William the Bastard. So, William subjugated all others who claimed kingship. William rewarded his Norman followers with fiefs taken from the English landholders, and William exercised many important powers of the state. Particularly, his exercise of national powers would enable him to insist on the people's loyalty.
Further, William subjugated all others who claimed kingship. Asserted kingship by both conquest and imperial succession, and claimed all the land of England belonged to him. William rewarded his Norman followers. William received their loyalty and a share of their revenues. William exercised many important powers of the state. He coined money, collected nation land tax, supervised royal courts, and had the right to raise an army and maintained Anglo-Saxon sheriffs to administer local law. And William was not the only one struggling at this point. There's a struggle for imperial power in Germany. No German king could claim rule over large tracts of land. Imperial authority of any ruler was bolstered by the alliance with the church.
Imperial authority of any ruler being bolstered by this alliance really has to do with the emperor relying heavily on the church leadership, specifically with appointing bishops and archbishops. Pope Gregory VII would insist that no layman could have influence on the church. And this is ultimately going to be an attempt to suppress Henry's ability to appoint bishops, as we shall see. Here we have the Benedictine Abbey at Keinec. High above the river Vistula, one of the most important waterways in Central Europe, the Abbey Keinec was founded on the site of an ancient Paleolithic fortress by King Casimir I of Poland around the year 1040. It's just upriver of the newly established royal capital at Krakow, and its monks were assigned the task of helping the king convert local pagans to Christianity. But why would Casimir have chosen this site?
Let's rewind a bit. In 1056, Henry IV succeeded his father as emperor. He was 6 years old. There was competition among his advisors, which led to a broader conflict. The German princes attempted to take power from Henry's regents. And, of course, hostilities escalated into civil war. Pope Gregory VII insisted that no layman could have influence on the church, and he allied himself with Henry's enemies, attempted to depose him. Henry was forced to beg the Pope for forgiveness and recognize his authority.
So, he ultimately reverses the relationship between secular and religious power. The power of the papacy began to grow throughout the 11th century. Local churches will fall under the influence of powerful families, bishops will be co opted into powerful families as well. Monasteries are going to become effectively privatized, havens for rich aristocrats. Many popes will drastically abuse their power and effectively compromise the credibility of the papacy as well, leading for the German kingship to, of course, want to have more direct control.
Now, wealthy benefactors relinquished controls over the monasteries. The benefactor family gained special spiritual privileges. Here we have Matilda of Tuscany, who mediates between emperor and pope. Now, Matilda was one of the most powerful rulers in 11th century Europe, controlling many strategic territories in northern Italy. She was fluent in German as well as Latin and Italian. She was a key mediator in the struggle between the emperor and the pope, and a supporter of the reforming movement within the church. The Latin inscription accompanying this manuscript miniature reads, "The king entreats the abbot," as the pope, "and even humbles himself before Matilda." Now, how does this image represent the relationships among these figures? Which appears to be the most powerful, and why?
Alright, with kingship and its invasions out of the way, let's turn our attention toward the church, specifically getting more into the whole monasteries and the monastic reform movement. Cluny is going to establish a new type of monastery in Burgundy. He's going to place the monastery under direct control of the papacy and under the direct protection of the papacy as well. He's going to see that wealthy benefactors relinquish control over the monastery, and that Cluny will sponsor the development of multiple monasteries based on this same model.
All the monasteries Cluny developed were attached to a mother house. They were not independent. They all engaged in the same religious rituals.
Indeed, and here's the Abbey Church at Cluny. Its extraordinary wealth and power made Cluny a major target for the French wars of religion, and again during the French Revolution, when locals had been subjected to its lordship for centuries, are going to raise the building to the ground, i.e., level it. This artist reconstruction, though, shows how the vast Abbey Church, as it at least might have looked in the 12th century, after several consecutive building campaigns for this. In its day, Cluny was one of the largest structures in Europe and a quintessential example of the architectural style known as the Romanesque. Hence the thick walls, thick buttresses, small windows, right? Not the high, almost floating archwork and spires of, say, the later Gothic style we'll get to. But I digress.
Now, Cluniac reforms were strongest in Frankish territories in Italy. There was an absence of strong king figures which allowed this. The monastic reform took different shape in Germany and Anglo-Saxon England, and we have the reformed responsibility of kings, Charlemagne being a pious model. Uh, Kings guaranteed freedom from outside influence. They chose abbots and bishops. The future kings of England had more direct control over church lands.
Kings would insist on poverty, chastity, and obedience, and following the same liturgical rites amongst the churches under them. Monasticism would become the dominant spiritual model for Western Christianity. Many monasteries would maintain parishes that served the spiritual needs of the people, and of course, they will hold relics, which would be collected and displayed at these monasteries to help attract followers. Pilgrimages to view said relics would become a form of pious act. Think of it as like a religious vacation. And many monasteries that house these relics would effectively say that they possess protective and even curative powers. And these relics on display become a way for the monasteries, more importantly, to make money. As they gain great revenue, there also comes a great competition for relics, including many, many faiths.
Now, we have the reform of the papacy. The reform movement in the monasteries began to affect bishops. Bishops and priests serving in the diocese were secular clergy. The abbots were often appointed to episcopal office, which brought monastic values and beliefs. Non monastic bishops were required to adopt stricter standards of conduct. The bishops began to rebuild and expand their cathedral churches.
So, secular clergy are ultimately going to share similar lives to their parishioners, at least initially. Cathedrals are really, though, more suitable reflections of divine majesty, and they begin to follow the Christian example.
Influence of these newly empowered bishops grew, and the reform agenda expanded. There was an attack on simony, the use of ecclesiastical office for personal gain. They demanded that secular clergy share the lifestyle of monks, and there was a resistance of celibacy.
The demands specifically for poverty, chastity, and obedience will become hard for some church officials for sure, but you really have to understand why. The reform movement targeted the customs of the church. Monks and priests would live very different lives as a result of their very different tasks. The demands of priestly chastity were seen as unreasonable because the vast majority of parish priests were married, and the only way to ingratiate yourself amongst the community really is to marry into it from the medieval perspective.
This increased wealth, power, and the acceptance of oversight. The Cluniac movement would encourage Pope Leo IX, who reigned about 1049, to push for reform. There's an issuance of decrees against simony and clerical marriage. He traveled throughout the continent to ensure that reforms were carried out, and he had a vision of the church as a monarchy.
Serious opposition will be held within the church. The Holy Roman Emperor, Henry III, would insult the Pope and ultimately remove him from local Roman nobility. The new Pope, Nicholas II, is going to create the College of Cardinals as a policy of advisors and overseers of the papal electoral process. However, this brings an end to today's ramble. Tune in next time for the investiture conflict, a return to the Byzantines, the First and Second Crusades, and a brief glimpse back into the Islamic world.